I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
Because we all have a responsibility to ensure the security, the prosperity, and the human rights of our citizens.
With the Taliban, a feeling of uncertainty has swept over some 19,000 Afghans waiting for special immigrant visas, or SIVs. The decade-old visa program is granted to locals working on behalf of the U.S. government who face threats due to the inherent risks of their jobs.
The U.S. imposes visa bans on Chinese officials in retaliation for Beijing's policies in Hong Kong. The UN and EU have also called for action to defend human rights in China.
On today's episode, we're talking with Bishop Garrison, the Director of National Security Outreach at Human Rights First, about the role of human rights in shaping America's role in the world and its credibility at home. Bishop, you and I have both served in national security roles in government and now have situated ourselves in the nonprofit space, working to improve policy with fresh thinking from outside. Tell me about your role at Human Rights First.
Sure, and thanks for having me today. At Human Rights First, I serve as the Director of National Security Outreach. I am a direct liaison to the military community as well as to the foreign policy and national security communities at large. I do my best to ensure that those individuals understand our advocacy role within the discussion of human rights, particularly as it pertains to the representation of refugees and asylum seekers here in the U.S.
And does Human Rights First focus mostly on refugees and human rights, or what is the general scope of interest in human rights in the United States?
Historically, we began as an organization that represented refugees and asylum seekers in the legal process of declaring their statuses. We continue to do that work to this day. Our refugee representation team is one of the best in the country and arguably the world at what they do. An incredibly talented pool of lawyers that are fighting daily to set forth new paths legally in the representation of these vulnerable communities. So that's first and foremost what we do. Another large piece of our activity today is working within the advocacy framework and being a very vocal partner within the refugee community as best as we can to serve here in the United States and in New York City and as well as on the West Coast in the continued discussion on what policies and what legislative tools are best to serve the interest of these vulnerable communities.
And human rights is a term that doesn't necessarily have one definition. You know, we know that norms and values can change over time. That's actually a good thing. How do you think about the definition of human rights from a U.S. perspective and the way that it should factor into policymaking given that complexity?
Absolutely. It can be amorphous. You don't want to boil the ocean just to get a pot of water. It can mean so many things to so many different people. So the way I approach it is empathy. When we think through our laws, when we think through our policies, when we think through our interactions with these communities, which are very typically communities of color, we should approach them with a great deal of empathy. They're going through a tumultuous time in their lives, through life-changing events. They're leaving in often war-torn communities, the only homes that they've known, in order to come to our shores. That's what I think about when I think of human rights. I'm putting it in the framework of the work that Human Rights First does with refugee and asylum seekers. But when we're thinking of human rights broadly, we're thinking about empathy towards our fellow man, towards our fellow human beings, and respecting their right to live, respecting their right to exist and to do so in a way that allows them the greatest opportunity for the healthiest and happiest existence possible. That's what human rights are to me. It's about giving people the opportunity to thrive, and we want to call on our government as a vehicle through which we do that. If the government is going to do anything, a part of its mission should be to provide some level of basic necessity and service and protection to ensure that people have the ability to engage in that opportunity and to find the best possible life that they can.
And that's human rights in both the domestic and the international context. Going into the sort of foreign policy context where you and I are pretty comfortable, we could go down a whole rabbit hole here, talking about the differences between this kind of foreign policy or that kind of foreign policy, but the foreign policy of any country really has to grapple with, the tensions that can exist between protecting human rights and some other policy goal. Or does it? How do you think about managing those tensions, or do you reject the premise of that question?
Well, to some degree, I reject the premises. Not to be disrespectful to your show.
Not at all.
To some degree, I reject the premise. Look, at the end of the day, when we say human rights, we're talking about people. So if there is a tension between what is best for the individual group of individuals and what is in the best interest of the state, I think we need to take a step back and really ask ourselves what this fight is about. It's about doing the most good. It's about preserving and protecting the most lives that you can, respecting the existence as best you can, and that is about, in my mind, that's more about the people. So now, granted, I don't want anyone to think I have this this type of naivete about the way that a state has to perform its duties and serve in that greater good interest. I think we should always look, however, from a baseline to leverage that idea. What does the most good? And if that answer is ultimately something that is more in the state's interest than it is the people's interest, I think we need to have a deeper conversation there. To me, if there is a tension, it should always be in favor of the rights of the people versus the interests of the state.
And let's talk about, real lives in real places. Is there a case or two where you think U.S. policy has really tough choices to make, and how would you approach one of those? And I realize I've just asked you to name one of about 1 million different things that you could pick, but let's dive into an example of, as you said, this sort of state versus the people, and how does that play out?
Well, I think we've had many over the course of, even over the course of modern history. I think about what happened in Somalia during President Clinton's term and how that was handled. I think about Rwanda and and how the U.S. didn't necessarily intervene. I think more recently, Syria continues to be a perplexing quagmire that American foreign policy hasn't quite adapted to or figured out yet. I think it's only become worse here in recent times as we see more upheaval through the ongoing civil war, and then we see the United States there with a limited presence, and we don't know, honestly, this current administration, without making anything political about it, it doesn't quite seem to have an idea as to what to do next. I think it was about a week ago we saw Russian soldiers have a negative interaction with American soldiers, eventually running them off the road. And it reaffirmed people's question of what are we doing there in the first place? Are we guarding oil fields now that don't lie in the American interest, that the Americans we don't have any claim to? Why are we there? I had a very close friend who's still in the Army who just came back from Syria not too long ago and is going on to his next duty station. And he was taken away from his family for over a year during this deployment while COVID hit. And again, we can't get a clear understanding of what are our ultimate strategic goals within that country. What are we going to do about al-Assad? What are we going to do about any portion of the situation that's happening? I think that's probably the biggest one we have right now, but I don't think the world or the geopolitical sphere is short of any type of complexities at this point. I think those are some bigger ones.
And if you're the government in that case, I'm not asking you to fix Syria. I mean, obviously, this has been a challenge.
I'll do it right now.
You'll just go for it. This has been a challenge across administrations. To be fair, what are the questions you'd be asking yourself as a policymaker? You just named one. Are oil fields a strategic priority? walk me through what would be a couple others that you just might think of.
Sure. What level of resources are we willing to engage in the use of while we're in that particular or engaging in that particular region or that issue? What is our moral authority? Is there a moral authority to engage? Are we seeing a grand loss of life? Are we seeing something like chemical weapons, for instance, being used on innocent civilians? If so, what are our predetermined responses, and what are we willing to risk? You have to even do a risk assessment on this. What type of blowback are you going to get politically? Are you going to have physically? Are you going to have to worry about getting yourself into any type of kinetic conflict within the area? I think there are a whole list of questions that have to be asked and potentially answered before you engage in this type of activity. The United States shouldn't. I believe in intervention, but I also believe in thinking through smart and sound decision making. And the United States is not and should not be the world's police force, but we should also remember that we have a set of American values that we hold dear. And when we see, again, having that empathy, that sympathy, when you see innocent life being lost, we have to determine, do we have the will and do we have the ability to step in and engage and help resolve conflicts and issues and protect life?
We'll be right back to talk about the role of private companies and nonprofit actors. Bishop, the role of the private sector and civil society is also really interesting here. First, companies, and full disclaimer, I'm currently getting my MBA, and so I'm very focused on the interplay between business, governments, and shaping policy, creating value, and human rights is creating value. What do you see as the role for the private sector in protecting human rights, and how is that evolving as global standards and values continue to change?
Sure. I don't think we have ever seen in our nation or in even world history a point at which you had so many corporate entities with so much capital and thereby so much power to engage in geopolitical debates and issues in a way where they can actually help to control or shape the conversation. I think you could probably argue maybe that World War II had, at least in the United States, had a similar context, given what we asked of industry to do in supporting the war effort. But we have corporations like Apple, which is now the world's first $1 trillion corporation. They in themselves they're a non-state actor, basically. They are a nation. A quite rich and prosperous one. So we have to ask, what is the government's collective responsibility and oversight and engagement with them? And then what would we and should we expect out of a corporation like an Apple in terms of their role as a global leader? I think you're seeing a lot of corporate responsibility popping up all throughout high levels of these corporations, in which they are internally asking themselves that exact same question, and they're looking for opportunities to do good. I think that's a start. I sometimes worry it is window dressing, that while they have corporate responsibility or community engagement offices on one end, you also have their business practices on the other, which may really speak to a different situation behind the scenes. So I think we need for corporations to practice what they preach. I think we need for them to really look internally at their business practices and determine what type of labor they're using, what type of policies do they have in place. Do they have policies that protect workers, that provide workers with the right types of benefits, health care, educational benefits, child care benefits? Are they helping to build a better society? At the same time, they really are attempting in their front offices and forward facing to be responsible, to be corporate partners engaged in this holistic community aspect. I think we should, as people, as society, as a nation, call on them to do just that, to ensure that they are taking care of the people that have helped them amass these large amounts of wealth, while at the same time calling on them to be better stewards and better citizens in our global community. I am a capitalist. I believe in capitalism. I'm fine with people making lots of money. They work hard to do that. I just want to ensure that they don't forget how they made the money, the systems that are in place in order to support them to build that wealth, the workers that work their tails off to ensure that these corporations are prosperous and do well overall. I want to make sure everyone is taken care of.
And as you said, a lot of companies seem to be taking a little bit more of a public stance on issues of civil society, human rights, and also, companies that are making transparency about labor, things like that, part of their business plan. Do you also see a role for companies to actually push the government in a positive direction? You mentioned labor, and I can imagine that, there might be occasions where some companies, they actually want to see more universal adoption of labor rights, for instance, so that their market is fair. They're not being held to a standard, that other competitors are not. So they might be actually able to play a positive role. Just curious for your thoughts on that.
I'm fine with corporations, with companies, business entities being at the table in these discussions. I think it's important to have the voice of industry represented in any time that you're thinking about holistic changes or anything that's going to have a large impact or effect on the way people conduct business. However, I don't think companies themselves should be shaping the discussion. A perfect example of that is social media and disinformation and misinformation. When you have companies that are the arbiters of what is allowable and what should be allowable, you begin to have situations in which a company like a media corporation, a social media entity like a Facebook, is the one that determines what is disinformation, what is misinformation, and you end up having issues of foreign interference within an election. So, and not just an American election, but elections worldwide. So, but that's not to say that people within Facebook don't have the acumen or the know-how or the prowess to sit down and have the conversations to determine what's best. The next big discussion that's on the horizon, once we do figure out, or as we figure out the disinformation piece, is AI. What are going to be the global standards of artificial intelligence? How are we going to determine, because this is going to have a lasting impact.
And a big human rights issue. If you can read people's minds or something, there was a great piece in the New York Times about this literally over the weekend, though, about, what is the human rights policy of AI?
Yeah, and well, I mean, if you even want to take it a step back in a more simple way, AI machine learning is already being used in terms of issues of privacy. Everything when you talk about biometrics, for instance, and we see the way that China is leveraging the use of facial recognition in its pursuit of issues of democracy, with finding resistors in Hong Kong. So all of that, at the end of the day, in part, is going to be shaped by how we determine what are the global impacts and outcomes that we want to see for that industry in its whole, in a whole, the total industry. Excuse me. So we have to come together as members of the global community and determine what are the aspects of this discussion that we want to see, and we need to bring industry in order to determine that, because they are the experts from a technological perspective. They are the ones that understand the capabilities of the technology, of the equipment, how it should run, what it is capable of doing. We need to understand that as best we can as we begin to create mechanisms for oversight and have deeper, more thoughtful policy discussions around it.
And we've talked about government, we've talked about industry. You just mentioned, obviously, the power of people. And, in foreign relations often talk about civil society, right? And civil society in the global sense, speaks to the role that opposition parties, advocates, nonprofits play in policymaking, and of course, the power of people themselves. We've seen people on the streets in protest movements, not just in the United States, but around the world. How have you seen people themselves be effective in shaping specific policy reforms?
Absolutely. To me, it's all about I started I guess my political career, I guess you could say, in a presidential election cycle, working hand in hand with people at a grassroots organizational level. So going knocking doors, making calls, having roundtables, going to cookouts, understanding what it is people needed from a baseline perspective. At the end of the day, that is politics, and that is what ultimately helps to form and shape policy. You can sit and write, and I've been a part of this, you can sit and write literally books about what the best, most thoughtful policies with some of the best Ivy League scholars you can. If you don't understand how to properly break down and message that policy, it's going to fall on deaf ears. If you don't know how to connect with those grassroots and, just as important, grass tops leaders about why your policies are going to be the best for their communities and going to have the most impact and the greater good, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to win out at the end of the day. And you can't govern if you don't win. So it is usually typically the young grass top leader out there who understands what his or her community needs and what they want to see out of that policy. And they're the ones that connect with the leaders. They're the ones that connect with the elected officials to determine how to best shape that policy in a way that is supportive for the overall community. I think a big example of something like this in recent years is the ongoing battle with making marijuana legal. We saw that it had a desperate impact on typically communities of color. When you look back at how disproportionately a lot of drug laws have been implemented and sometimes are often written. And you begin to see communities saying, well, what are the true aspects of this particular substance? How can it be used? How is it used? Is it really necessary to criminalize it? Could we at least decriminalize it? And people thought, well, that conversation is never going to go forth. And now how many states do we have? Whereas if not decriminalized, outright legalized. Like in Colorado, they have dispensaries now like vending machines that they recently installed. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about. At the end of the day, all politics are local, and not to be somewhat of a cliche, but it's true. And it's on communities and those young community leaders working with elected officials and getting the message out about what policies help the communities at a baseline level. I truly believe that's, at the end of the day, is what helps shape a lot of discourse, at least on the domestic side. I think the national security side and the foreign policy side tends to be a little different. But overall,
say more about that. What would be an example of sort of people power in the changing policy in the foreign policy space?
Well, the foreign policy space, I think it's more about bringing issues to light than it is most anything else. And also I'm kind of differentiating between national security and foreign policy. Because when you say national security, you can also talk about, for instance, policing. And that conversation that we're seeing happen right now in America, when you see an individual, an innocent man like George Floyd and the many others, Breonna Taylor, they're the latest. But when you see a man like George Floyd and the way he was murdered, and you see the response, it is the communities rising up that are marching in the streets, that are having these conversations, that are forcing and will continue to force broader conversations within the policy community about, well, what should the next steps be? When it comes to foreign policy, I think that tends to be a little different. I think it's more about our relationships and our associations, like who do we long-term want to be associated with and why. I think there are plenty of let's just say agreements that are within the interest of national security for a variety of reasons that we currently maintain. And it goes back to those tensions again that I discussed earlier. I don't think we've reached a pinnacle or a peak with some of those, but we often do have to ask ourselves, well, what is the true nature of this relationship? And at the end of the day, what are we attempting to get out of it? A great example of that, I think, is China. China is set to be by 2025 the largest economy in the world. China, in a lot of instances, have not been great in the debate and discussions over human rights. They continue to, in some aspects, be a threat to national security with regard to cyber attacks, with regard to misinformation and disinformation. And on other aspects, they tend to be somewhat of a strategic ally when it comes to discussions with North Korea and helping us keep Kim Jong-un as somewhat of a rational actor. As he continues to try to attempt to get a nuclear weapon. So you can't simply say that China is the bad guy. You can't simply say that they are our enemy, because in so many aspects we have to continue to interact with and determine what our relationship is moving forward with China. So what do we do? What does that ultimately look like?
We'll be right back to talk about some of the specific challenges and opportunities that are shaping Bishop's work. Bishop, you served 2 tours in Iraq, and I understand that a big part of what you do is work with other veterans to support special immigrant visas for translators who worked with U.S. forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. What motivated you to take on this mission?
Sure. So from my own experiences, the first 6 months that I was deployed, and in my first deployment in Iraq, I was without an interpreter. And that was a challenge, to say the least. And once we received an interpreter, a young college student from Baghdad named Muhammad Ali, as a matter of fact, he was fantastic, and he really changed my perspective on what was happening in those communities and what type of help they really wanted and needed. When we work with the local population in that way, when we work with the Muhammad Alis, they are putting their lives at risk working with us. So it's incredibly important that once that is identified and we have the opportunity to help them, we should take that opportunity. He did it for the benefit of our mission, to help ensure that I did everything I could to keep my soldiers safe and bring all of my soldiers home. So it's only right when their lives are threatened, when they're being intimidated back in their own home countries, that we do what we can to bring them here.
And immigration is a challenging space right now, both from a policy perspective, but also, I would imagine, from the pandemic. What's the status of your work right now?
So just like many others, I'm working from home. Our work never stops. Human Rights First is continuing to be in the trenches, continuing to go to court virtually. And doing all they can to continue the casework necessary to help the vulnerable communities to get them out of harm's way, and in some cases out of detention, which is even more dangerous now that COVID is running rampant, and that there are not proper protections in a lot of these holding facilities in order to properly protect people. And my slice of that is more focused on the advocacy and legislative side, with the NDAA now in conference and soon will be rolling out. We had a very productive session this year in terms of doing all we can to get as many of some of the large target, very important amendments through the process. I don't want to go too deep into some of these things. But suffice it to say, it was for my team, it was a challenging time to work through a lot of this. But our leadership did a tremendous job in trying to navigate the ship through some unsteady waters. I will also say for your listeners and individuals that know me that I also have been on a family leave during a lot of this with my little baby girl, who is will be 7 weeks on Wednesday. So
Congratulations.
I've been, thank you, been trying to juggle a lot in these times, but it's been very rewarding.
And the NDAA, for our listeners, is the National Defense Authorization Act. So is that intended to support some of these translators who worked overseas and have them to be able to come into the United States? Or what slice of that, to use your term, is your work?
Sure. And there are a lot of different aspects to it that we were looking and hoping to have broad support for. Not specifically for the SIV piece, but more so for a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the fight against racial injustice, the fight against white supremacy, particularly in the Department of Defense and other aspects of what we're dealing with here at home and more broadly in authoritarian regimes across the world. So a little bit of a different take to it.
Well, I mean, we talked last segment about the power of people in policymaking, and you mentioned George Floyd. How have you seen the Black Lives Matter protests this summer impact the work of organizations like yours?
Yeah, so for us, it's helped us to realize that there is a grand bit of opportunity when we talk about racial injustice. And its nexus with foreign policy, that there's work to be done, in particular with national security and the foreign policy communities. I wrote a piece with John Wolfstall for foreign policy where we kind of hit on that. And as I continue to say, it's very difficult for us to talk about politics and at the water's edge when here on our own shores we have not dealt with a lot of the underlying issues that that have long served as ailments that have placed entire generations of communities at a disadvantage. So that for the domestic side, I think that's how it's being affected. Internationally, and I said this in another conversation that I had some weeks ago, that as we all know, Secretary Pompeo made some comments condemning the Chinese government's actions in Hong Kong during a lot of the democracy protests, in which the spokesperson for the foreign minister of China came out and just said, "I can't breathe." That was their 3-word response to the entire a plethora of discussion points that we made about what they were doing was wrong. So
Yeah, we talked about that on a previous podcast here, which is it's hard as a diplomat sitting across the table from an interlocutor to have a human rights démarche, a point to make, and then, them come back and say, well, what about, this or that problem in the United States? And definitely, racism has always been something that it's hard for diplomats to defend.
Absolutely. And when we haven't, as a country, dealt with the original sin, and we could go back for at slavery and then move all the way through, you really see it impact Reconstruction, the Reconstruction era, when you talk about Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president, and the grand bargain he made with Southern states that he would remove federal troops from enforcing any type of Reconstruction level laws so long as they make him president. He did that. 2 years later, you get the Posse Comitatus Act that says federal military forces can't be used in a policing manner. And then shortly after that, you get the end of Reconstruction and the early stages of Jim Crow laws in the South. So there's an easy thread to follow from there all the way through a lot of this systemic race issues of systemic racism that we're dealing with today. And we have just never dealt with any of that. And it is incredibly difficult more and more. And now I think nearly impossible for us to continue to be the moral authority within the international discussion on a lot of these topics when we have not dealt with that at home. We can't talk about being the shining city on the hill if we're not going to deal with the problems that we've been facing for generations. And I say that in the same breath that I truly believe in the great American experiment. It's not who we are that I truly love and want to be a part of. It's what we are capable of being. And I want to continue to fight. We are an imperfect nation, and I truly believe that the more we fight and the more we continue discussions like these, we will see the next steps in our growth, and we will every day strive for a little bit more perfection, and we'll reach it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the positive side, we've seen civil society, take up this cause over the summer, especially, and really make what I think we all hope is a positive and lasting impact. We're having these kinds of conversations, not just about human rights all over the world and what America should do there, but what we should be doing at home, really a long overdue conversation. What areas are you most hopeful about for the future?
The next generation of students that we're seeing right now, I think we call them the Zoomers.
Zoomers, yeah.
Yeah.
You and I have some pre-Zoomer. I don't know, the even younger version of that.
Yeah. I don't even know what my son's generation is being called yet, but it's the teenagers right now. They have been so incredibly politically active, but extremely thoughtful in their dialogue and in the way that they are engaging the system. I feel as though for those generations, I see a lot less of angry angst and more very specific, thought out policy discussion. When you look at something like the Sunrise Movement, I don't necessarily agree with every particular aspect or point of the way they go about business or the policies, but it's refreshing to see so many young people in a discussion dedicated to something like fighting climate change and the debate over the next steps in the environmentalist movement that really should resonate with all of us. And there's always room for improvement, but from a baseline, it's having the azimuth pointing in the right direction in terms of your thoughts on morality, society, and your heart. And that is always very refreshing to see. And I think as a generation, generally speaking, you see a lot of that good coming out right now.
Thank you so much, Bishop, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter, @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.